as I was saying, Pastor James and Julie have been great friends. We got to know them through the Gospel Coalition over the years. And over that time, I found out that James and I actually played football against each other in high school. And so we'll just leave it at that. And so, but James he's been a great encouragement to me. And my ministry over the years. And, of course, we continue to pray for what he's doing there in Lahaina, preaching there, and grateful that he could be there. And just super excited about what God is doing in and through GracePoint Church right here. So with that said, we are going to be in Joshua chapter 2. That's our text for today. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn in them or turn them on, whatever you use. And we're going to be looking at this chapter. We won't read the whole chapter. We'll read some of it. We'll summarize some of it. And I think it's going to kind of dovetail nicely with what you talked about last week in the sermon about how GracePoint wants to be or is a gospel-centered church and wants to continue to be a gospel-centered church, which is simply saying that we want to make it about Jesus. And so this sermon today and what we're going to be looking at in Joshua chapter 2, I think kind of dovetails nicely because we get to see this radical grace. We get to actually see this gospel in action as it saves this shady lady that we're going to read about. Her name is Rahab. So the title of today's message is called Grace for the Shady Lady. And so we're going to begin by just kind of getting a little bit of an overview of what's happening so far in this chapter. Moses has died. Leadership has turned over to Joshua. And now, after wandering around the desert for 40 years, they are on the eastern side of the Jordan River. And so they're about to enter the promised land. I'll put a map up there, and so you guys can kind of get a frame of reference. And so they're about to cross over the Jordan. And as we might know, the first city that they need to conquer is Jericho. And so Joshua decides in this chapter that we're going to see, he decides, I'm going to send a couple of spies over to investigate what's going on in the land, and they're going to come back and report to me before we actually cross over to the other side to enter into the promised land. And so this is where we find ourselves in chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. I'm going to read the first 3 verses. And it says, Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 men as spies from the acacia grove. Some of your translations say from Shittim. Careful how you pronounce that. And so go and scout the land, especially Jericho. So they left and they came to the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. The king of Jericho was told, look, some of the Israelite men have come here tonight to investigate the land. Then the king of Jericho sent word to Rahab and said, bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, for they came to investigate the entire land. Now, look, I like a good espionage story. I like spy movies, right? But can we all agree that these are some pretty horrible spies? I mean, on the first day, they get busted, okay? And, they're already found out. The king knows that they're there. And so they stumble into Rahab, the prostitute's home. Maybe that's good spycraft. I don't know. Nobody's going to ask them, what are you guys doing here? It's kind of obvious. But for whatever reason, they get caught immediately. But they find this really strange ally in Rahab. And so if you skip down to verse 6, we see that she had taken them up to the roof and hidden them among the stalks of flax that she had arranged on the roof. And then, as the story goes, she sends the king's men on a wild goose chase. And then as the chapter unfolds, Rahab and the spies, we later learn, they make a deal with each other, right? So Rahab says, hey, look, I'll help you guys escape if you don't kill me and my family when you guys come in and raid Jericho. And so they tell her, okay, tie a scarlet cord or a rope on your window, which will indicate to us that we are not to attack your home and everybody who's in your home will survive. And so the deal is made, and then because Rahab's home her window faces the outside of the walls of Jericho, the men rappel down, they run off into the hill country for 3 days. The king's men are trying to look for them, and finally the spies return back to Joshua and give him their report. And so this is what essentially happens in this chapter. Now I think at first glance, we read this chapter, and we think, yeah, it's kind of a cool story, right? You know, you got a couple spies and a prostitute and they escape and all of that. But when you think about it, maybe I wonder if this chapter is even necessary to the story of Joshua. Because Joshua is all about the conquest of the promised land. And then here you have chapter 2 that doesn't seem very necessary to telling the story of Israel entering into the promised land. I wonder why we even have it here, and maybe we can even do without it, because if you went from chapter 1 in Joshua to chapter 3, you wouldn't even skip a beat. But here we have this story. And I think it would be unnecessary if Joshua was just simply a historical narrative. It was just telling the story about how Israel conquered the Canaanite land, how they entered into the promised land. If it was just purely historical. But I think we all know that it's more than just a history book. I think what's happening that we see in here, in Joshua, this unfolding of this faithful God, this God who is faithful to his covenant promises to his children, the Israelites. But also in this chapter, we also see God's faithfulness and radical grace to this Canaanite prostitute who knows nothing about God, didn't grow up in Sunday school learning the Torah. And we see God's radical grace reaching Rahab. And since that's the case, then chapter 2 is absolutely necessary. It's absolutely necessary to this story because it shows how God extends this radical grace to this shady lady. It shows how God extends his radical grace to someone who doesn't earn it or deserve it. This non-covenant woman who sells her body and treats sex as a commodity. And so, more than just a funny little story, this chapter really should blow our hair back. This chapter should really cause us to do a double take. Kind of like, wait a minute, how can this be? How can this even be? How can this happen for God actually saves Rahab? It shows us that God has this radical grace, but not only does it show us that God has this radical grace, this chapter pulls us into the story. It actually locates us in the story. Meaning we can't just read this as an outside observer where we just kind of read it and say, oh, that's kind of funny about the spies, and okay, Rahab helped them out, cool. We can't just read it from the outside. It actually pulls us into this story. It pulls us into this story because we realize that Rahab's story is our story. The Rahab story is actually our story. That is, we were the Canaanite prostitute who deserved death rather than salvation. We were the enemies of God who could not escape the wrath of God. Rahab's story is our story. You know, just like Rahab, we went from foe of God to being in the family of God. Isn't that amazing? Like Rahab, she was an enemy of God. She was a foe of God. And then it comes into the family of God. And so if you look at Matthew chapter 1, and you have Jesus' lineage, right, his family tree, you know who shows up there? Rahab. Rahab is she's in the family. She's part of the lineage. It's amazing. Rahab's story is our story. That who were enemies of God are now made the sons and daughters of God, the family of God. Rahab was saved from destruction in chapter 6, despite being a prostitute. Her behavior didn't save her. It was God's grace that did. Isn't that our story? that no one here, regardless of what school you went to, your background, where you grew up, no one here deserved or earned God's grace. That we were saved, not because you performed your way into the kingdom, not because you're good enough, but you're saved because of God's grace. So friends, this story is actually, it pulls us in. It says, Rahab's story is our story. And so we are recipients of this radical grace. We have this radical grace, and this radical grace that we are recipients of, it does something to us. It doesn't just leave us kind of neutral. It actually does something to us. It produces something out of us. It moves us. So, for example, if somebody gave you $5, right, just handed you $5, hey, spend it however you want. Yeah, cool, right? I mean, great. Put it in your pocket, maybe forget about it, wash it. 2 weeks later, you find it in the laundry. You're like, oh, wow, $5, right? Doesn't really move the needle. But if somebody gave you $500,000, that does something. You don't just stick that in your pocket, right? You take that, you pay off your mortgage. Well, maybe a fraction of it because we live in Hawaii, but, we pay off our mortgage, or you invest it, or pay for college, or go on vacation, or give it all to GracePoint. I don't know. But, it does something, right? It moves us. Well, grace is the same way. Radical grace moves us. It shakes us. It doesn't leave us neutral. And so what we want to do with the rest of our time this morning is I just want to unpack 3 ways in which grace and what grace produces out of us. I want to look at Rahab's life and look at 3 things that grace produces. It produces, first of all, faith. Secondly, it produces good works. And then third, it produces awe. Faith, good works, and awe. So let's dive in here. So the first thing, radical grace produces faith. It produces faith. If you look at Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31, which Hebrews chapter 11 is known as the chapter of faith, right? The hall of faith. And it's amazing that Rahab makes it into this chapter. It says, by faith, Rahab the prostitute welcomed the spies in peace and didn't perish with those who disobeyed. Rahab had faith. She had faith. And her faith wasn't just being convinced of the reality of God. But Rahab had faith that caused her to run to God as her refuge. Rahab's faith wasn't just in the spies keeping their end of the bargain. Her faith was in God as her refuge, who kept her from perishing. And so when she realizes who this God is, and that only He can save her, she runs to Him as her refuge. This is what radical grace does. One of the things that causes us to run to God as our refuge. Now, if we look at Hebrews chapter 6 up on screen, verses 18 and 19, it says, therefore, we who have fled to Him for refuge can have great confidence as we hold to the hope that lies before us. This hope is our strong and trustworthy anchor for our souls. God is our refuge. When we are recipients of God's radical grace, we run to God, not just because we know something about Him, but because He is our confidence. He is our anchor. He is this hope that nothing can take away God's radical grace from you. Nothing can take away God's radical grace from you. And this is what it means to run to God as our refuge. A lot of times when we talk about refuge, we think of storms and how we take refuge from these storms. Now, these storms are a lot of times come into our lives in the form of difficulties, circumstances that are outside of our control. There are certain circumstances that come and shake our lives. There's these storms in our lives. I think we're all old enough in here to realize that this world is not free from pain and suffering. And we all experience pain and suffering to some degree or another in this life. These storms come upon us, and when they happen, sometimes we can think, man, where is God in all of this? Where is God? God feels 1,000,000 miles away when we walk through these storms. Maybe you struggled with a certain circumstance or difficulty where you wondered even if God loved you. My friends, the beauty of radical grace is that when these storms come, it's not that God will prevent them, but he'll see us through them, and we run to him as our refuge, knowing that no matter how hard it gets, no matter that diagnosis or that bad news, no matter how difficult it is, God is our refuge, meaning that nothing will take away his grace from you. Nothing. And that's what radical grace does. It says, man, I run to God as my refuge. Maybe sometimes the enemy comes and he wants to bring a lot of guilt and shame to you. Maybe he's saying to you right now, how can you sit in this church, giving your past, giving the things that you used to do, the person that you used to be? Man, are you really a Christian? Maybe it's something that happened last week or even last night. How can you be here? And it's in those moments when the enemy will try to shame you that you run to God's grace as your refuge. We run to God's because God will never remove his grace from you. And that's the beauty of this radical grace. It actually moves us to say, I run to God as my refuge. So that's the first thing that grace produces in our lives. It produces this faith. The second thing that grace produces is that it produces this good works. So look up on screen, James chapter 2, verse 25, it says, in the same way, wasn't Rahab the prostitute also justified by works in receiving the messengers and sending them out by a different route? So what's amazing here is that James uses Rahab as an example of how faith without works is dead. Of course, we know that we're not saved by good works, but we are saved for good works. So James refers to Rahab's good work of saving the spies. But who else did Rahab save? You remember the story? Who else did she save? Her family. Her family. Her father, her mother, brothers, her family, everybody she could stuff into that house was saved. So I think one of the good works that radical grace produces in us is that we want others to have God's grace as well. That is, you want others to be saved. You want others to have this hope that is found in Jesus. It's kind of like, I don't know if you guys, who's on Facebook, but I'm part of this group called 808 Lunch Wagons. Am I the only weird one part of that group? I think so. Yeah, so anyway, 808 Lunch Wagons is this group that they take pictures of different food plate lunches from around the island, and it's just pictures of beautiful oxtail soup and mochiko chicken and all this. I mean, it's just and they take pictures of it and they say, this lunch wagon is awesome, it's cheap, it's convenient, tastes so ono. And I'm getting hungry right now. But the thing is that we take pictures of this because we want people to know about it, right? I mean, this is when you go to a good restaurant and we always want to tell people about it. Well, I think this is one of the same things that God's radical grace does. It shows us that this grace is not to be kept private, but that it's to be told. It's the story of God's redemption plan is to be shared. It went beyond Israel. It went to this Canaanite prostitute. And so I think one of the good works that comes out of us when we are hit in the face by this radical grace is that, man, we want to share it. We want others to know it. And you know who God uses to reach people with his grace? He uses Rahabs. He uses Rahabs to reach others. He uses people who have been impacted by this grace, those who know that God's grace isn't just a private matter. In GracePoint, to be a gospel-centered church, to be about Jesus, is to share Jesus. to want other people to know about Christ? What would it look like if all of us, all the believers in Christ, what would it look like if we committed to pray for someone in 2024, to invite someone to church, to share the gospel with someone? What would it look like? What would it look like if we as believers were compelled by this radical grace to share with others this grace in Jesus Christ, to share the gospel near and far? Not because you feel guilty or because James said to do it, but because, man, you know it needs to get out. It comes from this place of being deeply impacted by God's grace. One person. You know, my other church, we had this guy coming, and his name was Josh, and he was working with our youth. And so Josh, every day would pick up this kid, Kimo, from the high school, Kapolei High, and Kimo was a baseball player, and so they would go to the park, and they would just throw a ball. And they'd do this every day after school. So pretty soon, Kimo started coming to church, and Kimo gets saved, and he gets baptized. And then Kimo goes home, and he tells his dad and his mom and his sisters, hey, you guys, come to church with me. I want you to hear about Jesus. And so Kimo brings them to church, and I'll put this picture up. Here's Kimo and Guy. And Kimo's wearing the pink shirt, Guy's in the blue. And so Guy, his dad, and the sisters, they start showing up to church. I remember when Guy first showed up to church, man, he was wearing Terminator sunglasses, tank top, traps out to here, looked like he was going to knock somebody out. But Guy kept coming. Kimo kept inviting him. Come, Dad, come. So Guy kept coming week after week, month after month, hearing the gospel, hearing about Jesus. After a while, I looked at Guy. One Sunday I go, hey, Guy, I think you're saved. And he goes, yeah, me too. I think so too. And over that time, Jesus has worked in his life. Wasn't a big altar call, wasn't some kind of big special. It's just Jesus working in his life, knocking down the walls of his heart. It took one. It took Josh to reach Kimo to reach Guy. It's the reason why I'm here. I grew up in a Christian home. I went to a Christian school. But my mom, when she was growing up in Southern California in the 40s, a little girl would come to her window every Sunday morning and throw pebbles at her window to wake her up, take her to Sunday school. So every Sunday morning, she'd go with this little girl to Sunday school. And my mom grows up, believer. It's the reason why my sister and I are believers. Because that one little girl somewhere back in the 40s in Southern Cal brought her to Sunday school. Man, it just takes one. I think when we're impacted by the grace of God, we want this to go out. We want people to know this. And so that's the second thing that this radical grace does. And then finally, the third thing this radical grace produces out of us is an awe. Awe. Now, awe can mean several things. Like you can look at the ocean and be in awe of its beauty and its vastness. And on the other hand, you can look at the ocean and you can be in respectful fear of the ocean because you know it can kill you. Right? So there's this kind of respectful fear and there's this awe in its beauty and its vastness. And grace produces this awe in us. When grace hits us, we start to see the bigness of God and how we should be fearful, have a respectful fear of God. And I think this is what happened in Rahab. If we look at verse 8 of chapter 2, it says, before the men fell asleep, she went up to the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given you this land and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and everyone who lives in the land is panicking because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two Amorite kings you completely destroyed across the Jordan. And when we heard this, we lost heart, and everyone's courage failed because of you. Listen to this is amazing. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. Now, the one thing we know about Rahab is that she didn't have any kind of theological training. She didn't go to Sunday school growing up. But she heard about this God who is in heaven and earth, that is this God over all things, and that he is coming in righteous judgment, and that they don't have a chance. And so what's coming out of her, and this is amazing profession or confession by Rahab, this pagan Canaanite who has no training in the Lord whatsoever, and she is confessing that he is the God in heaven and in earth. And what's coming out of her is this awe in how big he is, and how vast he is, and at the same time that he can crush anyone he pleases according to his righteousness, his righteous judgment. I think here that we see this awe that's coming out of Rahab, where she realizes no one can escape God's righteous judgment and wrath. She has this respectful fear of God. But at the same time, she also realizes that God can save her. That God is the one who can actually save her from himself. God is the only one that can save her from himself. And so she has this awe, this amazement, this God, and you hear it in her confession, this God in heaven and earth. She's in awe of him. I think this is the same kind of response that we see out of the Apostle Paul in Ephesians chapter 2. In verses 2 through 5, Paul writes, "And we were by nature children under wrath, as others were also." We were under wrath. We were under God's righteous judgment. We had no chance. Verse 4, we read, "But God, who is rich in mercy because of his great love that he had for us, made us alive with Christ. Even though we were dead in trespasses, you are saved by grace." You see that emotion, the exclamation mark. Paul has the same amazement as Rahab. We were under wrath. We were dead in our trespasses. But God, he explodes in this amazement and this awe at God's mercy and his love and his life-giving grace. Seeing God's radical grace, my friends, doesn't leave us neutral. It produces an awe-filled response. A response such as repentance and gratefulness and singing and worship. We join God's family through baptism. This awe, this response, it moves us. Doesn't mean that we walk around just with emotional outbursts, but it does mean that we are amazed at God's grace. And I think this is why Rahab is referred to as Rahab the prostitute. Have you noticed that when she's mentioned, especially in the New Testament, it's always like Rahab the prostitute. It's like, man, give her a break, man. Why do you got to kind of keep that tag, you know? Like, I think it's there not because the Scripture's trying to hang her past over her head, but it's actually there because she's a trophy of God's grace. It's actually, Rahab the prostitute is to cause amazement in us. To say, wow. It's to cause awe in us. Like, that's amazing. That's awesome. Rahab the prostitute, God saved. And so it's there to remind us, to show us, to lift this up. Look at God's grace. And what's just as amazing is that not only does God save Rahab the prostitute, but he also saved Mike Ohara the prostitute. Mike the prostitute. Dead in my trespasses and sin, except for the grace of God who saved me and gave me life. What's amazing is that he saved you, the prostitute. Dead in your trespasses and sin. But by the grace of Jesus Christ gives you life. At the end of this chapter, the spies finally report back to Joshua, and they tell him in the last verse that the Lord has handed over the entire land to us. And because of God's faithful, amazing, radical grace, this land also includes Rahab the prostitute. She is included in the inheritance. She is part of this inherited promised land. So my friends, this morning, may the grace of God radically impact us. May it move us. May it produce faith out of us. May it produce the good work of evangelizing, proclaiming the gospel. And may it produce this awe in us that moves us, that shakes us, that causes a response out of us. Even as we sing and come to the Lord's table, we come not because we got it all together and we got it all perfect. We bring our Rahaby selves, and once again, we eat and we drink and we sing, and God affirms His grace to us again, right now, in this very moment. Amen. Let's go ahead and pray.